Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining Noteflight as we present a masterclass with Conrad Tao. We are really also fortunate to have this special opportunity. I know you join me in thanking Conrad for his generosity and willingness to share his insights with us. I encourage you to go to conradtao.com. I'm sorry, I don't seem to have control of the presentation, Christy. There you go. We're also fortunate to have this special opportunity. You can find links to all of Conrad's music and performances and so much more at his website, conradtao.com. You know, this masterclass really embodies what Noteflight is all about. Noteflight brings music to life by making it really easy to create, collaborate, and share music at every stage of the creative process for every level of musician, and we do that on any platform, so your music is always with you. And we support all manner of music learning, both formal and informal. This is a screenshot of pretty much what you're looking at on your machines. This is on the left side is where you'll see all the content. On the right side is a participant control panel. It defaults to auto hide, so you'll see an orange arrow as on this screen. You can click it, it'll expand, click it again, it'll collapse. If you have any questions during this masterclass, please type them in the question box and then press send, and we'll review those and we'll answer as many of those as we can once Conrad has finished his presentation. Also, please note that you will see a section called handouts in your control panel as well, and there is a one sheet there for download about Conrad, so you can download that and get even more information about Conrad. I want to just ask one quick question of the audience right now. Christy, if you could push that poll. So the question is, what is your biggest challenge as a composer? So please select all that apply. Is it ideas and creativity? Is it theory, harmony, notation? Finding your voice, your style, that you don't have enough time, or other? And so we'll just give you a minute to answer that, and this will help us help Conrad shape some of his comments. And then again, as I mentioned later on, once Conrad is done with his commentary, we will address some more of your questions as well. All right. Looks good. So, lots of questions about creativity and theory and harmony and notation and finding my voice and that age-old problem, not enough time. Don't we all know that one? Okay, terrific. Well, with that in mind, allow me to introduce Conrad Tao. The New York Times called Conrad a performer of, quote, probing intellect and open-hearted vision, end quote, while NPR Music called him, quote, a musician of deep intellectual and emotional means, unquote. Conrad was the only classical artist to make Forbes' 30 Under 30 Youngest Stars in Music list in 2011. And we're really lucky to have Conrad here tonight. He's going to share some of his compositional process and musical ideas behind his work, A Walk for Emilio, from his most recent recording, Pictures. So please give Conrad a warm virtual welcome. Conrad.
Hello. Hi, I think everyone can see me now. Thank you, Harry, for that really very, very, very kind introduction. This is really weird and interesting and cool and exciting. I cannot see any of you, but I see that you are here, and it's lovely to be speaking with you all in some form. As Harry mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about a piece that is off of my most recent album. The album is called Pictures. It was released last year in October on Warner Classics, and it was called Pictures because the album comprises several contemporary works by composers David Lang, Toru Takamitsu, Elliot Carter, and myself, alongside Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. And all of the pieces on that album concern images and memory and loss and sort of how all of those things interact with one another. So this piece, A Walk for Emilio, was written specifically for that album. And Emilio, the Emilio of the title, is Emilio del Rosario, who was my first quote-unquote serious piano teacher. I'm from Chicago initially, and Mr. D was, as we called him, Mr. D, was my first piano teacher who really sort of gave me repertoire that I could sink my teeth into as a pianist. My first piano concerto, my first, Beethoven sonatas and stuff like that. I studied with him. I started studying with him when I was 5, and I stopped studying with him when I was 9, when I moved up to New York, which is where I'm based now. He died in 2010, and I was 16 at the time. And he had been very ill for about a couple of years at that point. So he died in 2010, and in 2008, when I visited him, he really couldn't remember who I was by that point, by late 2008. So I've thought a lot about him since he passed away, since he died in 2010. I was 16 years old, and I was starting to do more as a musician. I mean, I think I was at an age when a lot of people are trying to really figure out who they are as people. And then since so much of what I spent my time doing was music, it was also about figuring out who I was as a musician. And I was already starting to work at this time as a musician, and so I was starting to maybe be able to conceive of what I wanted a career to look like. And, before that had been just such a far-fetched notion. So a lot of amazing things have happened since 2010, since he died. And over the years, I've often found myself wondering what Mr. D might say about the various things I'm doing, what he might say about my playing now, what he might say about my compositions, because he was an early supporter of my writing. And it's a strange feeling to be thinking about this, because it feels almost selfish. It feels almost like you're making someone's death about yourself. And at least that's how it felt for me. And it was a strange feeling to have that awareness and to have that consciousness, but that doesn't negate that complicated emotional core. So I felt like this was a good subject to write a piece about. Not just a person and not just a person's death, but really how one navigates a person's death, how one imagines things hypothetically when someone has died and it feels like you didn't get to do everything you wanted to do with them. So that's what guided the piece in its early stages conceptually. I mean, I basically knew what I wanted the piece to be about before I started writing it. And this is a piece. It's called A Walk, and it's what I like to call, kind of an imagined memory. If most of the other pieces on my album are about memories, this one is about an imagined memory, about a time spent with Mr. D that did not ever occur and will not ever occur. So it's about that murky emotional terrain. So the piece, I'm going to zoom in here. A little bit more. There we go. So the piece starts with just the left hand playing basically two independent voices, and it's an ambling figure. I've written slow and ambling as my tempo description here, and this is kind of the baseline walking figure, if you want to call it that, and it's basically based around these semi-melodic cells, these mostly three-note and four-note cells. So we've got two voices going. The top voice starts here, So it's just those three notes kind of wandering around, sometimes with 4 or 5 notes in the sequence. And then on the lower voice, we've got a triad, just kind of going up and down as well. So, and the piece opens with a fairly long statement from just the left hand of the piano, about 20 bars of music, and this walking figure, and it's 4 against 3 and 2 against 3 polyrhythms primarily. It's just like these rocking polyrhythms shifting kind of irregularly back and forth. And the goal is, I think, for it to feel almost comfortable, almost like a comfortable regular shuffle, but not quite. You know, it's always on the edge of slipping into actual unease, but it's never quite completely anxious or uneasy or any of those things. It flirts with all of that possibility. So, and there's some harmonic movement in this figure, but whatever harmonic movement there is very, very minuscule, kind of in keeping with the melodic material here being very, very minimal and slight in a way. So put it all together and it sounds a little bit something like this. So that's the opening figure. That's that sort of opening walking figure. And that keeps coming back throughout the whole piece. That walking figure kind of always signals a certain emotional area, if you want. That audio, by the way, that sort of weird, distorted, compressed audio comes from the album. We're doing a complicated screen sharing thing so that all of y'all can hear things, and so hence the bit crushing. But it comes, that's me on the piano, because we're using this nifty little synchronized audio video feature. Anyhow, so that is the opening figure, that is that, and it keeps coming back. And in fact, in the very next section, in section A, we have almost verbatim that left-hand figure with slight adjustments. Again, I think to keep things just a bit off balance, just the tiniest bit asymmetrical. But really the most important thing about section A now is that a more straightforwardly lyrical melody comes in. So this is the first voice really played by the right hand, played exclusively by the right hand, I suppose. And this melody is more rhythmically free, more lyrical. It's kind of wandering around languorously, and it's floating between different romantic worlds. If the opening left-hand figure is primarily 4 against 3s and 2 against 3 polyrhythms between quarter notes, so 3 quarter notes on a lower voice corresponding to 4 dotted eighth notes on top of that. So there's your basic 4 against 3 or 2 against 3s with eighth notes, and with 3 eighth notes and 2 dotted eighths. So if the main rhythmic values before are quarters, eighths, and dotted eighths, this new lyrical melody that's introduced at section A introduces a bit of a new wrinkle into the rhythmic landscape of the piece. In this melody starts kind of registering at the level of the triplet grid. So you have, in fact, the very first melody of this comes in off of a triplet. And so it enters not with either of the lower voices, but it still kind of creates, it still interacts with them. And something that a lot of this piece is about is, and I found, I will say, a lot of my music is about, is the way different voices and different components and different melodies interact with one another as if by accident. So this section is basically the first additional voice. Oh, what? That was not intended to happen. But so as you can hear, this top melody starts to sort of float in and out and interacts with the lower voices in slightly new ways. And I, I think I'm basically just trying to add another layer of rhythmic interest to the already pre-existing tapestry that's there. So this continues for a while. I'll get back into it. So that's that full statement of that initial lyrical melody, and it too starts to come back in slightly modified forms as the piece continues. But here now something starts to happen. These voices start to expand a little bit, expand and contract, and then they start to come together. And they come together into section B, where now where we've had, I think section A, we introduced a third voice. And by section B, we have 4 voices. We have 4-part harmony, basically. But it's 4-part harmony that doesn't really follow any 4-part harmony theory rules, which I did learn. But I'm breaking rules left and right. I have probably parallel fifths all over the place. Anyway, the bane of every composer, especially every young composer. And so all these voices start to come together, and in section B we have 4-part harmony, all in, at this point now, it's in rhythmic unison. The opening walking figure and section A were all kind of defined by voice independence, where if stuff happened together, if stuff came together, it was incidental and it almost immediately fell apart again. And here at B, everything comes together and stays together. But the melodic material is not as continuous. It's more fragmentary, not just from a pitch standpoint, as I kind of talked a little bit about in the opening left-hand figure, but it's more fragmentary in terms of like at the level of gesture. So we have, these melodic gestures, but they're interrupted by pauses, which are sometimes, really fairly deep breaths, and other times they're just kind of pauses, as if they're pauses in a sentence, perhaps. In general, actually, this passage to me feels a bit like speaking. These are breathing figures. There's a sort of pleading quality to them. There's a hesitance to them. It's kind of constantly swelling and pulling back. I think emotionally what I was aiming for here was this kind of space, this tense space between kind of resignation and urgency, somewhere pitched between those poles, if that's a dichotomy that you can make. I don't know if it is really, but it's somewhere between those two places. So at the tail end of A, these voices which were independent start to come together. So that's our first kind of structural interruption, I suppose, because before that we had the opening left-hand section and then the A section, which is the opening left-hand section with the melody on top, with a new melody on top. And so this B section comes in and is your first formal structural interruption, I suppose. And C, we go back. So that's the piece is kind of structured very simply as a ABABA in some way. And so C returns somewhat to the A material. I'm going to move that down so I can play from the bar. And section C basically continues the unfolding of the rhythmic tapestry of the piece. If section A introduced a lyrical melody that sort of started registering at the level of the triplet grid, section C kind of continues this by actually introducing these little twinkling arpeggios, these minor ninth arpeggios that really are kind of coming in from another room. At least that was the aural image that I had in my head, was sort of as if these triplet figures were just floating in. I mean, I mentioned before how I liked things to feel incidental, and one sec, sorry, technical stuff. I like voices to feel incidental in the way that they interact with one another, right? And I think this is the section where that becomes the most obvious, because these figures that are just floating in from another room, quite literally, the degree to which they interact with whatever's happening underneath is just happens to be the case. You know, it just happens to maybe be together with a certain voice. And there are a few different ways of doing this. I mean, I think if you might be able to infer this just based on the things I keep returning to. I do like trying to find ways of writing that free one from the grid a little bit. Funnily enough, I've written some music that I think is very, very gridless, like without any sort of rhythmic grid at all, and that is also quite interesting to me. But I do find there's this interesting middle ground where you're not completely gridless, but you're rubbing against the grid. So you're rubbing against like the limitations that are ostensibly posed by like the grid of 3/4, or you know, in this case 3/8, 3/4, 5/8, whatever. You know, just small things like feeling free to start a triplet, a 3/8 note triplet, which, you know, of course takes up a quarter note. Feeling free to start that on an offbeat, so that your triplet isn't always on the quarters of like the beats of your measure, that they're slightly offset. You know, that basically then you can create this illusion, and it's not really an illusion, it is basically a triplet that goes over a bar line, which in most music notation doesn't really let you do, because notation wise it is a little bit confusing and it looks strange on paper, but it makes a lot of sense. To me, it makes actually plenty of sense in practice, in like just when we're listening. It's something that's floating in a different place, just slightly off the grid. So I think it's fun sometimes to try to write a little bit off the grid and not necessarily completely off of it. So I think that is probably most obvious in this section. And again, I mean, even then, it's not really that much. It's all it really is sort of starting triplets off of an eighth rest and sort of trying to find the disorienting effect in that. So that is section C, which I will now play. There we go. am just now realizing that there's an error in this score. I'm going to change that right now. If you were looking and listening closely, you will realize that I did not play this note. I played this note. I did not play this note. I played this note. You learn something or notice something every single day. Anyhow, so at this point in section C, we've got 4 voices. It's 4 voices. If section B introduced 4 voices all playing together, at section C, these 4 voices are now, doing their own thing. And that middle melody, which was introduced in section A, is still floating around here. It's not exactly the same as it was, but it's occupying the same kind of color, the same kind of timbral space that it was in section A. It's doing its own thing, but now we have this triplet that keeps coming in from an extra room. Another thing that starts to happen in this section is, so we start to sort of see stuff deteriorate a little bit. We start to see stuff falling apart. In the opening figure, it's continuous for about the full 20 bars. Section A is continuous as well. There aren't really moments in the middle of these sections where stuff there aren't gaps necessarily. There's a lot of different stuff happening perhaps at the same time, and maybe they fit together weirdly at times, but they are relatively flowing. I remember I read some folks calling this piece dreamy, which was a little odd to me, but that's their prerogative to hear it that way. But in section C, we have this gap. We have a moment where everything just briefly drops out and then comes in again, but it drops out for a brief moment. And I like that feeling. I like the sense, when I'm listening to music, I like sort of almost being able to hear it break apart and crumble. And considering the emotional material I'm trying to work with here, the emotional territory I'm trying to mine, that seemed appropriate to literally create, to dig out that space in the score. After this, section C, we have, again, if the structure of the piece is A, B, A, B, A, so we have another section where all the voices come together in rhythmic unison in these kind of breathing, pleading harmonic figures. But unlike in section B, there are gaps like there were in section B, but now this little triplet figure in the other room, which is introduced in section C, starts kind of coming in when it's not supposed to. It starts interrupting the harmonic unison material. And even then, even before this, you can see it in the score here, but even before that, you have these top 2 voices breaking away from the strictures of the 4-part harmony. You have them breaking away in kind of an upwards moving melodic gesture. So here again, things are continuing to fall apart a little bit and deteriorate a little bit, but really it's more just that the foundation, whatever foundation I might have set up earlier, is starting to break apart a bit, or is starting to not seem as solid as it might have. And so this continues happening, and sometimes these triplets get folded into the 4-part harmony, and sometimes they just kind of keep floating independently of it. and section D ends with a crescendo to, I think, what is the first fortissimo in the score. So kind of a brief moment of frenzy, of emotional intensity, where the piece had been kind of aggressively subdued, even sort of almost like slightly medicated. Here it really grows into something full-blooded, perhaps. And then by this point, so then we get to our final section, which is section E, and nominally it's another instance of material A. It's the left-hand walking material again, but now we're back to square one in a sense. We don't really have any of that lyrical melody anymore. We don't have these triplets in the other room anymore. We just have that opening left-hand figure, and now it's basically completely broken apart. It's just these kind of little gasps, these brief moments, and they're punctuated with these really high stabs at the top end of the piano. So all of this fortissimo right-hand stuff here, and it's hard. I want to talk about what those high stabs are, except I don't know, it feels a little bit, it's always hard to describe what an element of your score is really representing or is really about, because, I mean, you kind of, it feels like there's always that risk of taking some curiosity away, but if I had to say what those top notes are really, what they are, I suppose, they're kind of a compressed moment, basically, of all of the emotional stuff that guides this piece, all of the anger, resignation, frustration, what have you, all of it coming together in these short bursts of sound at the very top end of the piano. And, I mean, so much of this piece is, to me, about tension and about seeming contradictions, and I suppose these blasts of sound are kind of an igniting moment, or a spark, or a combustion, just a quick moment of all of those things coming together. And as I mentioned, there's some harmonic movement in this left-hand figure, and there continues to be, even as the left-hand figure at this point has been kind of blown to pieces. But the very, very last line of the piece, after the final high stab, which is an F, which is, I suppose, nominally the tonal center of this piece, is sort of like a F. One of the modes, off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think it's like a kind of a fake Dorian. I think this piece is like, you could describe it as like kind of pseudo F Dorian. But whatever harmonic motion there might have been by this very end has disappeared. By this very last moment, which almost seems to be a return to the continuous material of the early parts of the piece. But by this point, whatever harmonic motion there is gone, and you're just the left hand is just kind of obsessively focusing on the first few notes of that early pitch material. So this is the final section, and I'll just for demonstrative purposes, I'll just start a little bit before, so we get sort of the crescendo and stuff. And that's the piece.
Thank you, Conrad. That was remarkable. Thanks for sharing those insights. Conrad, as you can imagine, we've got a slew of questions, and
Okay.
so many of them focus on how you start to compose. So,
Hmm.
do you sit at the piano and write? Where do the ideas from? Do you start with a melody, a theme, a chord? So can you talk maybe a little bit about some of, I'm sure it happens all different kinds of ways, but what is the composition, the beginning like for you?
Sure. Yeah, I actually something I was going to talk about and I forgot to is this piece at least. As as you sort of said, stuff is always every piece starts differently. It really does depend on the project. But this one started with that opening left-hand figure that I was talking about. It started with that rhythm, and actually, come to think of it, those pitches. It's kind of just the germ. It's about finding a germ of an idea, and one that you actually feel like you can mine. And I vividly remember this. I was on a train. Um, and I think it was like on a train from upstate New York coming into the city, and I was literally playing on my knee, and it was that left hand figure. It was that polyrhythm and that sort of uh, particular organization of notes, and then it just started unfolding. So I think, and I've had a few pieces that really just start from a rhythm paired with a chord, and some vague idea of like a chord progression. But sometimes it's just the barest chord progression, like two chords. Sort of a very pop approach to a chord progression, which is just two chords. Sometimes that's all you really need to take to get started and to really get rolling. My approach has often just been to also to write down as many ideas as I can. I have so many things that I never ever actually have worked into pieces, but they're there, they're ideas, and I last night I scrawled something um, onto staff paper. I use a mixture of computer notation. I use a mix of things. I record stuff onto voice memos. I um, put stuff into Ableton. I write stuff on staff paper. I really feel like it's just getting stuff down. And in terms of also like recording ideas, I'm a big proponent of just having like regular notebooks, not just staff paper, like notebooks, blank notebooks, no lines, and so that you can kind of draw maps of a piece. You can draw, just rhythms, and you can draw your own staffs. I think that's because sometimes I think staff paper can also feel limiting, where you're just like, I have to write in this form. Even if you're looking at like a panorama view of just like one staff, it can still feel limiting because you're just like, I'm limited to this space. Sometimes a blank sheet of paper is the most useful tool. But other times it's playing a rhythm on your knee on the train.
I love that image. Um, somebody asked a question about your ability to use rhythm and different time signatures to actually create breath and
Mm,
breathing in your piece. Can you talk a little bit about that?
that's really lovely. Actually, that's a really nice uh, thing to hear because it is something I think about. Um, I Funnily enough, there's kind of a very unscientific, non-theoretical answer to a lot to this. Um, to a certain degree, it's really just about breathing yourself and paying attention to how you breathe and paying attention to your pace. And one of the things I find very useful in terms of thinking about pacing and in terms of structure even is listening to speech, thinking about different approaches to narrative. And then taking very careful note of how you breathe and how you space a sentence out and all of these things. Very often they don't really line up with a rhythmic grid. I think I was introduced to this idea of writing very, very unscientifically, non-theoretically, where you just kind of trust your breathing and trust your mind and instinct to a degree, where you're aware of how much time is passing, and then you sort of just try to figure out, well, okay, how much time is that? Okay, that's sort of a 5/8 bar. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's literally starting with the organic thing, and then trying to figure out how do you notate that within the strictures of music notation. And I know a lot of people who completely bust open music notation and don't even use traditional staves and stuff, but I do find it sometimes a fun challenge to do it within the limits of like standard notation and time signatures and what have you. But then there's the flip side, which is trying to find and trying to play around with rhythms. Sometimes you can play around with very simple rhythms and just organize them in ways that, seem wrong, but you're using those tools and working within the grid, but kind of deliberately doing things that feel wrong, which is what so many people have done. If there are any pianists here, we didn't do a poll asking about instruments, but if there are pianists here, and even if you're not a pianist, look up on YouTube, because so many people on YouTube upload performances and stuff with scores. Look up like Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 109, and try to find a score to look along with it, like on IMSLP or something. And it's an amazing piece. It's a beautiful piece, but the score really looks a little wild at times, and it's suddenly 50 notes in a line in a system, and it really, when I saw that, I was like, oh, this actually feels almost like the music I was writing when I didn't know the rules of music theory. When I was just like, I can use this software to put stuff in and it turns into music, that sort of clueless sense of wonder and experimentation. There's like a long history of that.
Well, thanks for that, Conrad. And we really do need to start wrapping up. Again, I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights with us. And I encourage everyone to go to conradtao.com to learn more about Conrad and his music. If we could go to the next slide. Conrad has very generously and graciously agreed to actually give you some feedback on your scores. So create and share your score in Noteflight, make it a public score. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Noteflight. And we've had a post pinned to the top of our timeline about this masterclass since the middle of January. Just paste the link to your score in the comment section there and submit a couple of questions. We'll all review them. Conrad will review them. And for the next 3 weeks, Conrad will offer some feedback. Again, impossible to address every question about every score, but we'll do the best we can. And lastly, one more gift, if you will, in this night of gifts from Conrad. Conrad wanted to share his score, A Walk for Amelia, with everyone. So right after this masterclass, he's going to make that a public score in Noteflight. So if you just search for A Walk for Amelia in Noteflight, you will see that. So next slide, please. So all of us at Noteflight, we hope you enjoyed this special opportunity with Conrad. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. Thank you, Conrad, again.